Welcome everybody to the third and final best practices session we're doing over lunch. We've been doing them at this time for the past 2 weeks, so this is our third and final week. I want to thank everybody for joining us. The participation has been really solid in these. We've had between 70 and 100 people joining us at this time. The questions have been really good. The information being shared has been great. I want to remind everybody that the meeting is being recorded today. So if you don't want the inside of your office to be forever archived on the internet, you can turn your video off. We will make this recording available if there's people on your team or people in your network you think they should have been here but they're not. Feel free to share it around. It's a good thing to do that with. And I want to start by doing a quick thank you to the people who were able to make this happen. In addition to Janelle, who's been an amazing support for the committee and has spearheaded a lot of the work on this. So Grant is applauding and I join him in that. And we've had members, as is the case with the way ONEIA works, members who have stepped up and said, I will lead that piece. So in addition to Grant, I know JP Marini and Ellen Greenwood are joining us today. Thanks to the three of you for taking leadership on this. Our industry works best, I think, when people step up and say, this is not just an issue for me, it's an issue for everybody. How can we move this forward? So today's a good example of that. And we'll be back right at the end to do a quick summary. There will be a Q&A toward the end too. So if you do have questions during the presentation, feel free to pop them in the chat window, or when we get to the end and we say, does anybody have any questions? You can either digitally raise your hand or put a question in the chat, and we'll try to facilitate a Q&A toward the end. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Grant Walsam, who's going to take it away for the presentation. Grant.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, thank you. This is a little bit of a longer one, so if we do run out of time and you don't get a chance to get your question in or answered, if you could direct them to Janelle, and she can consolidate them, and we'll certainly make sure that you get some response if your question's not answered. We have a lot of ground to cover today, so let's get moving on it. Today's best practice discussion is on qualified persons. As Alex had said, wouldn't have been able to do any of this work without the awesome assistance and dedication of Ellen Greenwood of Greenwood and Associates, and JP Marini of Terra Nova Environmental, and of course Janelle, who's just been amazing through this whole. But really fabulous input from our steering committees on all three of these best practices, and we'll identify those people near the end. But today's topic is qualified persons. All of our materials around the best practice documents, the training modules, these presentations, such as today's and the last two that we did, are all available on the ONEIA website. And I just really want to point out that this work is developed by the industry for use by the industry. It's not an ONEIA product, it's an industry product. So just to give really quick context and some background for those that maybe haven't been to the other discussions. Ontario Reg 406-19 around excess soil management and reuse was announced finally in December 2019. It was a long haul. The ministry put in yeoman services for a couple of years and coming to this package, and I think that they've done an amazing job. There was a couple of amendments that came in July and December of last year. But, why is this important? And excess soil, it's soil that's been excavated and typically during construction activities, but needs to be moved off site because it can't or won't be reused at the development site. And there's a number of reasons why. Could be space, could be geotechnical instability, those types of things. But, the RCCO and OSPI did a study a couple of years ago where they estimated that there's over 25 million cubic meters of excess soil generated in Ontario every year. And while excess soil, most of it can be reused safely, much of it has, limited levels of contaminants, and care needs to be taken where it can and can't be reused. Significantly concerns in urban centers, surrounding communities, municipalities, rural areas, indigenous communities around where that soil is being generated. So very important. The improper management of soil that may be marginally contaminated really can have negative effects on ground or surface water quality and natural areas, agricultural lands, and the like. Also, a lot of the management around that could also, have local issues like noise, dust, truck traffic, damage to road, erosion, drainage, and other social and economical health and safety concerns, plus the environment, as I just mentioned. Local reuse and proper management and tracking of excess soil has many benefits, significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transporting soil, if those opportunities can be realized, reducing illegal dumping and inappropriate relocation, making sure that you're on the right roadways and so forth, and decreasing road damage, decreasing the amount of soils that could be reused rather than going to landfill, and then cost savings associated with decreasing in transportation and landfilling the excess soil. So all very, very important in why we're doing this regulation and implementation of the program. So the reg itself, 40619, was released in early December. It is law. They have exemptions for low-risk soil management activities, exemptions from requiring waste environmental compliance approvals. And the regulation is now, the first phase has been implemented. It's past January 1st, 2021 now, and it will be implemented over the next few years up into January 2025. And then some grandfathering provisions have now been extended to 2026. The rules document that's appended or associated by reference to the regulation outlines details on implementation of planning documentation, such as the assessment of past uses, sampling analysis plans, excess soil characterization reports, soil storage and processing, as well as requirements for tracking, the quality standards, the reuse rules. And again, that's required by law because it's referenced in the regulation. Other things supporting documentation and programs that are coming around the regulation are the fact sheets that the ministry is developed. And when I spoke to them a week or two ago, their response to me was that they're coming soon. And we're excited about seeing those. And they should fill in really nicely with these best practices that we're developing. The best practices, again, they're developed by industry stakeholders. Although ONEIA led the project, they are developed by the industry for use by the industry. The best practices are recommendations. They are not legal requirements. The documents themselves do outline the regulatory requirements, plus a section on plain language, and then a best practice around that regulation requirement. It is intended to outline and clarify how stakeholders can best implement the requirements. The best practices may not be universally acceptable, but stakeholders are encouraged to review them and integrate best practices where it can be done. As I mentioned earlier, additional best practices, aside from the QP one that we're discussing today, cover topics such as hauling and temporary sites. And as we discussed informally before the presentation, OSPI is working through developing best practices for pits and quarries reusing excess soil. And they look like it should be sometime ready in March. The municipal bylaw tool language that was originally developed by the Canadian Urban Institute has been updated as well. So all of these pieces together should help us implement the regulation requirements. So what does 40619 apply to? And, soil is unconsolidated, naturally occurring mineral particles, and, all of that legalese, but I think we all know what excess soil is. But the new amendments to the regulation now includes crushed rock. And that's to help out with things like tunneling spoils and so forth. But excess soil, if it's to be taken off site, will become, excavated soil, if it's going to be taken off site, will be classified as excess soil, and it will be waste unless you meet the requirements. Excess soil can either be dry or liquid. However, for reuse, it has to be on a dry form. If you're going to be beneficially reusing it, it can't be stockpiled for infinitum. And soil is to be dry and the quality and the quantity have to align the necessity for what the beneficial reuse site will be. If the soil is not dry, a local instrument must be used to permit the deposit of the liquid soil, or go to a site that has an ECA for processing of liquid soil. Liquid soil can also be processed at the project area itself where the soil is being generated, or at a local waste transfer facility. To reuse excess soil, you must have consent in writing to take the soil so that it's not illegally dumped. So the consent in writing is to come from the project, the reuse site owner. And the soil, if it's staying within the project area, is not classified as a waste. If you're not meeting the regulatory requirements, you will be subject to be classified as waste and could be disciplined under OREG 347. The management aspects of it do allow for a number of processing activities and so forth where you don't require a waste ECA. Those are low risk processing, but they're still subject to the regulation 406. So QPs, who are they? We'll talk about that in a minute, but they do play an integral role amongst the project, excess soil project lifecycle, where the responsibility always solely maintained with the project leaders. But the QPs could work with the project leaders through the project area and through temporary soil storage sites. And it could be the same QP in that respect, because the project leader should have care and control of the temporary soil site and may probably, and is most likely to use the same qualified person. Qualified persons could also be working at the deposit site. So that could be an instrumented site. It could be a beneficial reuse site. But we're also finding that qualified persons may be included with contractors on large projects where the procurement of the tenders may require qualified persons through the management of that excess soil in the contract. And we're starting to see and hear about those opportunities coming. It's really important that, QPs should not be the same QP for the project leader or the deposit site, and oftentimes with the contractor. The roles of the QP should be clearly defined, and you should avoid crossing over any of these areas to avoid conflicts of interest, and we'll talk about conflicts of interest in a little bit. So who's a qualified person? And that's defined in Reg 153, the Record of Site Condition Regulation. It could be a professional engineer with proper expertise or professional geoscientist with proper expertise as well. Qualified persons could also be a risk assessor, and they're required to provide the ministry with the variety qualifications when they register as a QPRA for their filing of record of site condition with the Ministry of Environment. Also wanted to point out that QPs cannot hold a direct or indirect interest in the project. So if I own a property, I'm going to do some excess soil management on it, and I'm the QP, I cannot be the QP for that project. However, I do want to point out that a QP may act in respect of a project for which their employer holds a direct or indirect interest. So if XEG, as an example, owned the site, we could have one of our professional engineers or geoscientists or risk assessor act as the QP for that project. However, they can't be one of the owners of the company. I wanted to point that out. And we have to have professional judgment. You have to be able to use that in your education, professional experience, in order to advise on the appropriate reuse options for the excess soil and help make decisions around the appropriate analysis and characterization. Ethics and public trust are huge. And it's not only a best practice, but also a matter of ethics and professional conduct to ensure that the professional engineer or the geoscientist only work within areas of their appropriate knowledge, skills, and experience. Management as excess soil is no different than those same things for what you do on a daily basis as an engineer or geoscientist. QP should only be providing excess soil management services if they have the appropriate education and experience in that practice. It's also important to point out that we as QPs have the responsibility to protect the health and safety of the public in our practice. This includes upgrading and building our body of knowledge and our practices and avoiding conflicts of interest. Part of what the QPs are relied upon doing, and it's very, very clear in the documentation and the regulation and the rules, are some of the planning activities around the excess soil. And these will occur at the project area. And that it starts out with the assessment of past uses, which is very similar to a phase 1. And then after that, if you've identified that there could or could not be any activities that could have created contaminants, is developing a sampling analysis plan on how you're going to determine the characteristics and quality of your soil. And then once you've analyzed the soil and summarized that, you would prepare a soil characterization report, which is similar to a phase 2 environmental site assessment report. And then once you've identified the quality of your soil, you're to develop and prepare an excess soil destination assessment report. These are required for any site that is going to be listed on the excess soil registry. That will come in place as of January 1st of 2022 and is in current development by the ministry. We're going to talk about these documents a little bit more detail in the coming slides. It's also important to note that if documents are older than 18 months, the activities that may have taken place on that property should be thoroughly reviewed and the documents updated as needed. We're going to talk about this a couple of times, but any documents that are prepared under this planning activity should be considered as living documents, and they are required to be updated as needed through the excess soil management cycle as conditions change or new information is gathered. Part of the best practices around documentation, QP should fully understand those reporting requirements and what goes into pulling those together. Have a great understanding of the time that it takes and what those are so that they can be fully communicated to the project leader. The project leader is ultimately responsible and is the one that makes all decisions. QP should also communicate these requirements and any limitations or uncertainties that come around any of those findings. So it's very important that it's a direct dialogue, and you should be thinking about as working as a team with the project leader rather than solely. With the assessment of past uses, under section 2 of the regulation for non-reporting circumstances, an assessment of past uses is still required to be prepared by the QP unless the project is excavation of soil at a stormwater management pond, or if there's been a RSC compliant phase 1 ESA already prepared and is still applicable with that 18-month rule. Again, if it's older than 18 months, it's regulatory requirement as referenced in the soil rules and in Reg 153. The document should be reviewed in detail and updated to reflect the current conditions. That should all be documented for sure. If you have an RSC compliant phase ONE or phase 1 ESA, it does meet the requirements of the assessment of past uses. But if it's old, it should be reviewed and updated as necessary, and we just talked about that. And that's really done to ensure that you didn't create any new potentially contaminating activities or areas of potential environmental concern that have not been documented, investigated, and characterized. With the sampling and analysis plan, the sampling analysis is required if the site falls within a registry reporting, and it's required to be prepared by the QP, especially when there's potentially contaminating activities have been identified in the assessment of past uses or the RSC compliant phase 1. If any of the project area is or was previously an enhanced investigation site as defined in 153, and that would include sites like gas stations, dry cleaners, or industrial properties. Sampling analysis plan is also a requirement for stormwater management pond cleanouts. If the soil has already been deemed to be required to be going to a waste management or processing facility, and an official sampling analysis plan is not required. However, when a sampling analysis plan is required, project leaders shall ensure that the QP implements or supervises the implementation of the plan, and in fact does the sampling itself. To go back to the destined for waste management and processing facility, that's usually because if that soil has been already identified as going to that, it's usually part of a remedial planning, and the assessment has been completed and informed the remedial planning. And it's not necessarily going to be destined for excess soil use or reuse or beneficial reuse. Soil characterization report. Keep in mind this report will likely be provided to the deposit site, the beneficial reuse site, or site with an instrument to procure the acceptance. So it's very important that this is fully documented and describes which parts of the project area were sampled and analyzed, describes which areas of the soil will be reused on site and sent for processing and disposal, or for reuse or beneficial reuse, and identifies what types of reuse or final placement sites can be used based on the quality of the soil. Example would be if it's a table 2.1 site that it could go to, etc. When you're doing your sampling, best practices around the minimum sampling and analysis. And there's been a lot of discussion around this through our community, discussions with the analytical laboratories, etc. But let's keep in mind that in some circumstances, performing the bare minimum sampling requirements may not provide you with the fully characterization that you require. There could be changes in geological conditions, at depth, where segregation of soil may be needed. And the final deposit site or other reuse sites may and will likely require further analysis than the bare minimum. Per section B of the rules document, the minimum analytical is the BTEX and PHC package, metals and hydrides, SAR and EC, and other contaminants of potential concern that would be identified in the assessment of past uses. You also need to keep in mind that there's leachate analysis requirements as well. The number of samples are identified in the rules document based on the volume of the excess soil that is to be generated. Additional considerations from the sampling. It is advised to collect more than the minimum, as the following situations may also occur. You need to ensure that you have sufficient sample volume to ensure that you can get leachate analysis done. The leachate analysis is always on the highest 90% of your bulk samples. So if you've got lead at a certain level, you need to make sure that your leachate sampling and analysis is done on that highest lead sample. So also keep in mind that the project may change at a later date, and the originally estimated soil volumes may increase and additional analysis results would be needed. So going with the minimum samples may mean more work and costs later, as it can lead to project delays, and time is money, especially when you're working for developers and so forth. So ensuring that you've got enough samples, and usually more than the bare minimum, is a recommendation. It's also recommended because geotechnical properties of the soil may be observed and may be changed during the assessment or the excavation activities. QP should consider sampling and analyzing the different soil types and horizons for the appropriate number of samples to ensure that if you're sending soil to, say, one site and you've got another different geological material, say a clay material that maybe you need to go to another site, you want to make sure that you've got that fully characterized. When sampling analysis may not be required, a best practice is still to collect the representative numbers of samples for the minimum analyses recommended, and ensure that you're not you're able to identify any risk or an adverse impact of placing the soil at the receiving site. When the QP is relying on this information prepared by other people that cannot be validated or relied upon, An updated sampling analysis may and likely will need to be completed so that you can ensure that your soil is fully characterized and you won't have any delays in you're trying to relocate your soil. The excess soil destination assessment, that's a report where sites that need to be listed on the registry, the QPs to prepare a review of potential reuse sites and possibly disposal sites for the excess soil placement based on the quality and the quantity of excess soil that's going to be generated. Multiple sites may be used depending on the qualities and quantities, and for that reason, the report should summarize the estimated volumes to be deposited at each site that's been identified and the type of site that it's going to be. Again, this is a living document and should be updated as newer alternate sites are identified and or intended. This includes updating it on the registry when required. Further best practices in determining excess soil destination sites. Keep in mind, it is the responsibility of the project leader to select the deposit sites. However, the QP may and most likely will be requested to support the selection of the appropriate reuse sites. You may be required to speak directly to the QP for the deposit site as well. So some best practices around the selection of sites is try to find local sites that are the closest acceptable sites so that we can ensure that we are minimizing greenhouse gas emissions. When looking at sites, consultation and collaborations between the QPs, the contractors, and the project leaders should take place to identify any and all deposit sites that may be applicable. And there could be times when a QP may be asked to complete the cost-benefit analysis for the different sites. When you're looking at things like comparison of tipping rates versus the transportation costs and potentially the greenhouse gas reductions that may be realized in choosing a certain site over another site. Just checking the time there. Exceptions for document requirements. Planning documents that we just went through are not required when the project area are fully on agricultural properties or parkland, residential, or institution use, provided the excess soil will be not relocated to an agricultural use property. These exceptions do not apply where contaminants are known or suspected, even though those types of site uses may be the ones that are where the soil is going to be generated. This should be identified in the assessment of past uses for the Phase 1 ESA. It's really, really important that the QP and the project leader fully understand the project area history and the property use designations as outlined in 15304 in determining whether or not you need to require those documents. Best practices around some of those exceptions would be is to still prepare a brief document where justification of the property uses and the confirmation of no known contaminants. Despite exceptions for historical use in urban parks, agricultural spaces, etc., they still may have contaminants. We've seen too many times when things like contaminants like pesticides, herbicides, metals and inorganics that are resulting from biosolids reuse, could have been a fuel tank leak, etc. So it should be very, very careful when we get there, because we've all seen examples of where property has unknowns and we found impacts that could not be predicted. I'm going through a review of that now on a site locally here. And that's a topic on its own, but we all have seen that. So just because the property of a certain use and it looks nice, the example would be this picture here. We've all seen those examples where there's hidden gems under there where consultants make their money. Best practices around and requirements around updating of documents. The regulation itself states that if the project leader or the operator of the project area becomes aware of any of the following circumstances, the project leader or the operator of the project area shall ensure that a written record of the circumstances is immediately created. This includes the date on which the circumstances became known to the project leader, operator of the project leader, or any other person involved in the project. Examples of that would be when additional testing has revealed that the soil characterization report does not accurately reflect the quality of the excess soil. Additional areas of potential environmental concern have been identified, and they were not reflected in the assessment of past uses. When excess soil is intended to be transported to reuse site for final placement, but that site is not identified in the excess soil destination assessment report. In any of these cases, the project leader or the operator shall ensure that within 30 days after the date of the project leader or the operator becomes aware of the circumstances, the qualified person document should get this document required to be prepared under the supervision of a qualified person or the qualified person, and make those necessary amendments to the documents that reflect those circumstances. Until the excess soil management project is fully complete, the planning documents should be considered as living documents, as I mentioned earlier. This could be for all larger projects likely that will be updated throughout the project when things change. To assist with this, document version control should be identified with clearly labeled version numbers and dates to ensure that the most up-to-date document is appropriate version can be easily identified. Even when there's not a requirement for the project leader to prepare these documents, it's important that the project leader considers retaining a QP. And I know it sounds like a sale for my services and my friends and colleagues in the QP community services. However, there's so many opportunities for things to go sideways. So when you're not required, you still should look at having a QP. Summary of information that should be prepared for the project leader needs to provide to a deposit site, such as, but not limited to, the soil volumes, potential contaminants of concern, soil types and sources, and the laboratory certificates analysis and any summary tables with comparisons to the standards and how you determine that soil quality. You should characterize soils as much as practical within agreed budgetary and timing limitations and ensuring the regulatory minimums are met. Prior to the construction beginning, this should occur. When the project leader is not required to file a notice under Section 8 or with the registry, it is still best practice to ensure that all documents and records generated are prepared in the spirit of the standards of the excess soil planning activities. And that would be assessment of past uses, sampling analysis plan, the soil characterization report, etc. When the project leader requests documentation or records be produced that do not meet those minimum requirements of those documents, this request should be documented in the project agreement and clearly identified and described in the documentation of records prepared, with the corresponding limitations on the findings that are summarized. So if you're being asked to do something that doesn't meet the requirements of the regulation, it should be fully documented. And the discussions with the project leader should be had on why that's not necessarily a good idea. Observation procedures. So when excess soil is being excavated and so forth, and when suspected contamination, excuse me, is suspected and encountered, it's still a best practice that the QP for the project be contacted for advice and recommendations on managing the suspected contaminated excess soil. Confirmatory sampling and analysis to delineate the impacts should be completed by the QP and approval of the project leader. Understanding that the appropriate assessment and management of the suspected contamination will likely stop or slow the project, appropriate temporary measures should be considered, such as segregating the soil and stockpiling it during the assessment. Further, appropriate reporting turnaround times for the laboratory analytical should be selected and the incremental cost should be fully communicated to the project leader so there are no surprises. When a change in the excess soil quality relative to the original soil characterization report has been confirmed, the excess soil planning documentation needs to be updated to reflect this new discovery, as we talked about a few minutes ago. However, on a project site where the planning documents and activities were not originally triggered, once the possible soil contamination has been identified, the soil regulation planning requirements are triggered and must be followed. And that includes contracting a QP to prepare those documents. So if you can identify contaminants, now you're back into required to do those planning documents. It's still a best practice, even when suspected contamination is encountered, that the QP be contracted and advised for advice and recommendations on managing the suspected contaminated soil. Leachate testing. Again, this is another hot topic in the QP community. And it's a requirement in the rules document and is part of the regulation. Leachate testing is required to be completed on a specified number of samples that's dictated by the volume of excess soil that's going to be generated. And that is 3 samples plus 10% of the number of the bulk samples you are using to characterize your soil. The leachate testing is to be done on the samples with the highest bulk concentration of the contaminants of concern. So that's on 90% of those samples. How you characterize the soil in the leachate, it can be SPLP or the TCLP method, and may be performed. However, the pH of those leaching acids is slightly different and may give you different results. The recent amendments have also identified that the modified SPLP is to be now used in characterizing excess soil as of January 1st of 2022. So we'll keep the TCLP procedures for waste characterization for disposal, landfill disposal, processing, those types of things. And SPLP should be used solely for excess soil regulation. Best practices around the leachate testing. And we've talked about this because there are still a lot of questions and uncertainty. Best practices will include to understand that not all contaminants of concern have a leachate screening level and a standard associated with that. Until those, standards have been established, only testing for contaminants of concern in the leachate table should be done. You should ensure that more than adequate sample volume is supplied to the lab to ensure that the leachate testing can be performed, because this is usually identified after the bulk analysis. Ensure that the analytical lab is aware that this project is an excess soil management project and that leachate testing may be required following the reporting of the bulk analysis of contaminants of concern. In your communication with the project leader and other stakeholders, ensure that there is adequate time communicated to provide for that second run of the analysis in that time frame and within the appropriate cost tolerance. So those should be identified at the proposal stage. Communicating the project leader and the scope and timing of the cost that covers the leachate analysis is really important. And use of the modified SPLP and analytical method should be done for excess soil. When excess soil meets the background standards, so table 1, your soil testing, leachate testing should not be completed unless the pH is outside the normal range. There could be further developments in the science around leachate testing and standards developed and laboratory capabilities. So it's important and incumbent upon the QP to ensure that the information is fully up to date on those developments. Excuse me. Sorry about that. In reuse sites not governed with an instrument, if you're developing site-specific standards or using the BRAT model or a full risk assessment, the QP is to be retained by the operator of the reuse site to do that work. Any best practices around the reuse site for the QPs are very, very similar to those that are employed at the project area. The BRAT, Beneficial Reuse Assessment Tool. We did a presentation back in October, I think, with the Ministry of Environment on the use of the BRAT, and some case studies were presented as well. It's a wonderful tool. It's a risk-based model for the reuse site to use to assess whether actual site conditions may allow for soils with concentrations that are higher than the generic standards would be for that type of use, or the potability of the groundwater in that area. If the QP is going to develop the site-specific standard using the BRAT model, you are to apply the site-specific quality standards as outlined in the soil rules. When the BRAT model is complete, the QP is to complete the declaration of the accuracy of the input information and ensure that the reuse site operator has provided a copy of the declaration and BRAT output worksheet. The QP is also to file that BRAT document with the MECP. A full risk assessment is also an acceptable alternative to the BRAT. However, the BRAT is a wonderful tool. It's very simple and easy to use, and is based on the modified generic risk assessment model. Qualified persons at Class 2 management sites. These are temporary sites operated in consultation with the qualified person on behalf of the project leader or a public body. QPs can assist in ensuring the temporary sites are constructed, operated, and maintained in a manner that ensures the health and safety of all persons and prevents adverse effects within the meaning of the Environmental Protection Act, and ensuring that there's no impairment to water quality within the meaning of the Ontario Water Resources Act. At temporary sites, the QP is likely the same QP for the project area, and similar best practices at these sites should be employed as we've talked about for the project area. QP needs to understand the soil storage rules, setbacks, pile size standards, segregation, rejection, procedures, security, and those types of things around the temporary site. We develop best practices for temporary sites, and those are also available on ONEIA's website. A lot of questions around qualified persons for public and large infrastructure sites. There's no specific regulatory requirements for QPs in relation to those, but there are some exemptions for public and large infrastructure sites where the QP should be aware. Filing of excess soil projects on a registry is not required if both of the following are observed. Soil is generated from an infrastructure project, such as highways, transit lines, railways, gas and oil pipelines, sewage collection and water treatment systems, distribution systems, stormwater management systems, electrical transmission distribution system, telecommunication, and any structures related to the infrastructure, construction and operation, and any rights of way for those infrastructure. Project leader intends to relocate the excess soil to a reuse site owned by the project leader or a public body for another infrastructure project. Filing of the excess soil project on the registry is not required if both of the following are observed. Soil is generated from an infrastructure project for the same type of infrastructure I just listed, and project leader intends to relocate the excess soil to a reuse site owned by the project leader or public body. Although there are exemptions around the registry filing for public and infrastructure projects and the specific details around the planning activities, meeting the excess soil quality standards or site-specific standard in conformance with the regulation and rules is still required. Best practices around public and large infrastructure sites is those sites should still complete documents and reports as they may be required by your deposit site that may not be associated with the public infrastructure. possible higher potential for Class 2 sites, temporary sites, and use these sites for characterization determinations when possible, not possible to be completed ahead of the site. So best practices around temporary sites should be employed. Due to the size and scale of the project, work to limit greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible as a core aspect of the project design should be implemented. Details for QPs around hauling. There's no regulatory requirements for QPs specifically around hauling. However, the project leader may request the QP be the contact listed to answer questions regarding the soil quality on the hauling record as required by the regulation. QP declarations. Documents prepared by the QP must have a signed declaration that all necessary information has been provided by the project leader, that the documentation has been prepared under the supervision of the QP and is complete and accurate and conducted in accordance with the regulation and associated rules document. For the BRAT documentation, the QP declaration attests to the accuracy of the information and the assumptions made. So best practices for the QP declaration would be that all documents prepared should be considered as equivalent to making a declaration of the authenticity of all the information, even if not presented as an official declaration. All documentation should be signed with the appropriate QP's professional qualifications clearly stated. Background on the rationale for preparation of the document should be clearly stated, and reference material made to previously prepared documents which summarize the background information. All documents should clearly outline to the client whether or not they meet the standards and limitations of the documents, and ensure that the insurance coverages for the QP and making declarations on excess soil management activities. So you should ensure that your insurer is aware that you're making those types of declarations. Liquid soils, we talked about that a few minutes ago. In the regulatory regulation, it's noted liquid soils can be processed at the project area through passive mechanical dewatering processes or processed at a local waste transfer facility. Liquid soils are collected and hauled for delivery to a waste management facility that has been issued an ECA for liquid soils management, or a reuse site with a site-specific instrument governing the deposit management of liquid soil. There are a few in the province. Best practices around that is decisions around liquid soil are made by the project leader, but the QP may assist in determining if the soil is liquid via slump test. QP should be aware of what activities can be performed on the liquid soil and where. So very important in your communication with the project leader. We have a number of slides on additives and polymers. I think we're getting close to our time for 1 o'clock, so I'm going to skim through these really quickly. A QP does have responsibilities around the determination of the adequacy of the additive and polymers and making sure that when excess soil has been used or dewatered with additives and polymers, that the reuse site is fully aware of that addition. QP should complete detailed review of the polymer constituents and ask for case studies and long-term monitoring data from the manufacturer distributor where applicable. All review findings should be documented along with the QP opinion on the adequacy of the use of that material. There's a lot of responsibility on the QP for using additives and polymers. I'm going to skim through the next few slides here, excuse me. When mixing materials with liquid soil for the purposes of dewatering at the project area or the local waste transfer facility, mixing can occur provided the mixing is not for the purposes of contaminant mitigation or exposure reduction. The mixing material cannot be waste itself. If it's a manufactured product, the volume of mixing material should not exceed the manufacturer's recommended dose. And if you're mixing with natural non-polymer products, such as non-pressure treated wood chips, sawdust, mineral-based materials like bentonite, sampling analysis per the requirements in the registry filing can occur after mixing the product, provided the QP is of the opinion that the mixing does not change the outcome of the excess soil characterization versus the applicable quality standards. Again, very important that the QP is involved when using additives and polymers. Local background concentrations, I will touch on this quickly. There are areas in the province that may have constituents like naturally occurring metals that may be above table 1. Soil quality standards can be deemed to be met when the excess soil does not exceed the naturally occurring concentrations typically found in the area of the site. QP should be documenting evidence of that naturally occurring parameters is provided to and retained by the reuse site owner and operator. QP should also retain the documented evidence on file for a minimum of 7 years. When you're encountering what you perceive to be local background concentrations, you should be referring to the OTRs that are published documents and local background concentrations in the province. Discuss this with the local MECP office or municipal offices. And you should be able to demonstrate that the background concentrations exist outside the project area and are not associated with an area of potential environmental concern or potentially contaminating activity that may have occurred on the property. QP has responsibilities with pH in soils that are outside the acceptable ranges. The reuse site has soil outside of the 5 to 9 for surface soils or 5 to 11 for subsurface soils. The excess soil must meet the Table 1 generic quality standards, and any required leachate analysis must meet the Table 1 leachate screening levels. If that pH soil is to be deposited at a reuse site, the owner operator of the reuse site must have the QP complete an assessment of the potential impacts of the placement of the soil and confirm it will not cause an adverse effect. The project area QP should provide that documentation and identifies the cause of the possible outside of range pH and have that fully delineated and mitigated if possible. Project area QP should provide a summary of the results and demonstrates that all other parameters in the excess soil meet the Table 1 quality standards and leachate screening level. If you have a QP for the reuse site, the QP should have that information and understand the cause of the pH being outside the ranges. And where applicable, the reuse site QP should also confirm that the placement will not cause an adverse effect and make suggestions regarding how the soil may be managed. The recording of the placement of the material on the site should be recorded for future reference as well. I want to ensure that the QP is aware of practices around data reliance. It should be understood that information, data, and documents generated by the QP will be and referenced by others, whether or not such reliance has been provided. However, an expectation for extending reliance should be expected and well documented in any and all communication surrounding the movement of the excess soil. When a QP is assumed that data prepared by others, consideration into the accuracy and representativeness of the data and information shall be assessed prior to relying on any of that data. There are no requirements or regulatory requirements on data reliance. As we talked about earlier, best practices around record keeping. It should be ensured that documents and records can be available by the QP firm for longer than 7 years. Electronic versions shall be organized and uniquely named for future search and location by other assignees of the QP's firm that generated the documents and records in case the QP that was involved has relocated or moved on or retired. The firm employing the QP should be able to easily source, identify, and supply the information generated for a minimum of 7 years. To kind of come into some closing here, we've got all of that information and some other additional information in the best practice documents that are on our website. We also have an on-demand training package that can be accessed. The one here is a Prezi. It's a Prezi platform. It's wonderful because it's self-directed. You can push yourself through the presentation rather than following along slides like we just did. So you can do it at your own rate. And we have one of those for each of the 3 best practices we identified. I really want to outline the work that our steering committee did. Between JP and Ellen, I would not have been able to pull any of this information together, and they were excellent. Our steering committee members for the QPs is listed here, and I really want to take a minute to announce that we're really proud to be working on establishing qualified persons community of Ontario. We're looking to launch the QP Co in the next month or two, likely with a March launch date. So please stay tuned to ONEIA's communication platform for news around this, but it's a really exciting project that we've been working on. And Alex and Janelle have been assisting in getting that off the ground. So that's want to wrap it up there. I know that we're over time. I apologize for that. I do have a few minutes to take questions, Alex, if there are some, or if you have to drop off, I do completely understand and look forward to any questions.
Sure, that's great. And thank you, Grant. And thanks, we had more than 100 people joining us today, so that's fantastic. And the good news is in the chat window, there were a bunch of people who actually solved their own problems, which was great. There were people who had questions and other people helped answer them, which was nice.
Bravo.
Yeah, I know Joe had a question earlier in the presentation. Janet Babechko, by the way, said, really pleased to see recommendations that do more than the bare minimum, which is key for due diligence. And I think there'd be general agreement on that. Joe had a subsequent question that said, do the requirements apply to mining metals projects?
Mining metals projects.
Mining/metals, yes.
That's a good question. I'd have to look up that, but I think if you're generating excess soil to be used as for beneficial reuse, any soil that's being generated would definitely have to fall in that in the requirements of Reg 406 for sure.
Okay, great. And there were questions around crushed stone and around which version and where the regulations are. And thank you, Manisa and Krista, for answering those questions in the chat window. We have from Janet Babechko an observation, and it's an important consideration for data reliance is that key to include in your contracts up front about reliance. Same goes for the 7-year record keeping. Don't underestimate how long 7 years is and how changes in technology can impact how you find and retrieve documents. So that's a good reminder, Janet. Any reflection on that, Grant?
No, I think that, like anything, you should have everything spelled out on the reliance and so forth. But I think that we should go into this with the expectation that when you're generating these excess soil documents, they are made so that you can communicate your information. And so those reports will be handed around to stakeholders. And I think it's really, really important that, that documentation may be handed around and will be listed on the registry. So it should be expected that that documentation will be handed around, and you can't always strictly limit the use of those reports in your reliance.
Great.
53. Save.
Oh. Somebody was going through their voicemail. Ryan Smith actually has a reminder, and I'd love to get your opinion on that, Grant. It's in the chat window. But it says, Grant, I'd be wary of suggesting that the provision of reliance on planning documents should be expected. Understood that the market may decide, and I do agree that public bodies, for example, may be seeking this. However, we recently saw requests for reuse sites, their QPs requesting reliance on project area planning documents. My first response would be that the point of having a QP for the reuse site is to make their own determination as to the quality of the soil and the data. About do reliance letters add anything technically? Are they, and this is a kind of a thought-provoking question, are they licenses to sue?
And all consultants, we all have our reliance limitations and so forth. And I'm not saying that you can't do that. What I'm saying is you should expect when you're preparing those documents that they will be handed over to the QP, say for the reuse site. You can't simply suggest that it's only for the project leader, those types of things. So you should expect that all documents are going to be handed around, and understand that. And so you can limit your reliance all you want. And the other thing is, when you're looking at information, you should expect that there is limitations on reuse of that. You may have to seek that out. It's just more of a being aware that, you know, the typical reliance and limitations on reliance may not be quite as applicable here.
Good question. And Colleen has a question. Is it a conflict of interest to act as a QP for both the source and the reuse site?
Our steering committee had a long discussion on this, and I think we talked about it 3 or 4 times through many of our discussions. And sometimes there are benefits to be able to supply services to both sides. However, you may get caught later on if a lawsuit arises, if you're acting for both ends of the project. We have in our best practices that it should be avoided. However, if there are benefits in the same QP acting for both the source and the reuse site, that should be clearly defined, and both the project leader and the reuse site are aware that you're doing that service for both of them and what limitations may come from doing that. So as long as everybody's aware of what's going on and who your initial allegiance will be with, it's not a conflict of interest if everybody is aware of that.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for any final question anybody'd like to pose in the chat window. And in the interim, by the way, Janelle has put in the chat window a link to signing up for the ONEIA newsletters, information around sessions like this, information on the QP community that Grant was talking about. That'll be coming out. And so feel free to click on that and register, and we'd love to keep you in the loop about what's happening. So Grant, I'm not seeing any further questions. Usually when I say that, one pops up, but I don't see one popping up.
Oh, there it is.
Oh, there it is. Okay. A little low. Question from Colleen again. When you mentioned some exemptions for low risk sites, is that defined somewhere? Is there a definition of low risk?
There's not a definition of low risk sites. That's determined through your assessment of past uses and so forth. This is the low risk processing activities. And I think you maybe have heard me say that. And that's a series of processes that can be done in the project area with the soil that doesn't require an ECA. That could be soil turning. It could be screening for removal of debris. There are, I think there's 7 or 8 of them. Could be mechanical or dewatering, as long as it's on the project area. So there's a list of those, and those are clearly defined in the regulation and the rules document.
Great, thank you.
And our best practice document, by the way, it's in there as well.
Absolutely. So Grant, we're going for 10 after 1, so I think we're 10 minutes over, so maybe we'll wrap there. If people have other questions, feel free to email them through to the ONEIA office at info@oneia.ca. And as Janelle pointed out, the information from the best practice documents and these sessions are available through the ONEIA website, so if you want to share them to your with your team. I want to thank everybody for coming out today, and I'll turn over to Grant for the last word.
Just thank you for your time and attention. I apologize for my voice getting a little dry and hoarse in the furnace type atmosphere in the winter. So my apologies for having to stop to get some water, but a lot of information covered. But please access our information on our website and look it over. And if you have questions following up, you can certainly pose those to Janelle and myself or other people on the excess soil working group with ONEIA can certainly help you address those.
Fantastic. Thank you, Grant. Thanks again to Janelle and the committee for doing the work. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. Have a good rest of the day. Stay safe. Stay healthy.